In one of my previous videos talking about cheap budget level filters, I showed off that I had the Sigma 85mm f1.4 art lens. Now somebody did ask if I could do a review video talking about this particular lens. And if you watch a lot of my other videos, you might notice that my shelving unit is a little bit empty. Because today I'm going to talk about 4 of Sigma's art lenses. So, the 4 art lenses that I own and will be discussing today. I have the 24mm f1.4, the 35mm f1.4, the 50mm f1.4, and of course the 85mm f1.4. Now the reason why I'm going to talk about all 4 lenses in one video is because, well, they're all so similar to each other. Because they're all obviously made by Sigma, they're all part of Sigma's global vision lineup, which means from the exterior, they all have a very similar design. Optically, they all perform very similar, and they also have the same sort of downfalls. So I figured I'd condense all 4 into a single video. Firstly, let's look at the build quality. Now, Sigma, a few years ago, before they started this global vision lineup, they really were seen as a kind of budget level camera manufacturer. So it was always a case of, yes, they were very cheap compared to the expensive lenses, but they never performed like the expensive lenses. Canon, for example, they have their kind of budget level lenses, and then they have their L grade lenses. And the Sigma of old would always kind of try and rival the budget level lenses. Then back in 2012, Sigma announced their new global vision lineup, which was aimed at a more premium level lens, better optical quality, trying to rival the higher end lenses from the likes of Canon and Nikon. And they kicked it off with this, the 35mm f1.4. Now this lens really caused rumblings in the photography community because this lens was sharper than the Canon 35mm L lens, which was a very popular lens with professionals. And since then, Sigma have released a string of new global vision lenses, several of them good zoom lenses, but most notably their prime lenses. The prime lenses that they have been releasing have either been completely unheard of, like the 14mm f1.8 or the 20mm f1.4, or they are lenses that other manufacturers make, like the 24, the 35, the 50, the 85. But the thing with the Sigmas is they offer fantastic image quality that rivals the likes of the Canon L lenses, but at a fraction of the price. For example, the 35 and the 50 at the time of release were about £700 brand new. By comparison, Canon's equivalents were about 40% more expensive. So optically, I would say there is no question that the Sigma art lenses are fantastic. A few people will say that the colours off the Sigmas aren't particularly flattering or not particularly true to life. I've never had any problems with them. I mean, I post-process all my images anyway, so I get the colours looking how I want them to look regardless, but I have never had any issues or quarrels with the colours that have been coming off my Sigma lenses. In terms of build quality, these lenses have always impressed me because they feel very sturdy, they feel very weighty. The barrel is all either metal or very tough feeling quality plastic. Nothing about holding this lens makes it feel remotely cheap at all. And I love the fact that every single lens is styled pretty much exactly the same, because it doesn't matter whether I pick up my 50 or my 24 or my 35, they always feel so familiar to me. The only thing that lets these lenses down, and particularly the earlier lenses that they released, the 24, the 35, the 50, pretty much everything up until the 85, none of them were weather sealed. Now, I don't know if all the new lenses are completely weather sealed or not, but they certainly at least have the rubber gasket on the back to at least offer some protection, which is something that these don't have. Now, along with how well the lenses feel to hold, I also love how well they balance on the camera. Even the monstrous 85mm with an 86mm front filter. When this thing first came about, I was convinced it was going to be an absolute to try and use. And really, it wasn't. I was so surprised. I was convinced it was going to try and nosedive at every opportunity. But it really doesn't. I mean, obviously, you feel the weight on there. There's no getting around it. You put a lens that big on a camera, there's going to be a little bit of front heaviness to it. But it's nowhere near as bad as I was expecting. I can only presume that they've kept as much of the optics as possible towards the back of the lens, because the kind of center tipping point is somewhere around about there. So it never feels unwieldy to hold. It actually feels kind of quite nice, and they've compensated with having such a big grip. It makes holding it an absolute dream. Now, if you've ever done any reading up on Sigma's art lenses, I guarantee you one keyword will have been mentioned at least once: autofocus. Now, all of Sigma's lenses employ HSM autofocus, or hypersonic motor, which is basically Sigma's equivalent of the likes of Canon's USMs. In terms of autofocus speed, they work really well. I mean, they're not as lightning fast as the likes of Canon's 70-200, but then you're not really going to be using lenses like this for sports. They're more portrait and wedding lenses. So they're not blisteringly quick, but they are more than sufficiently fast enough for the kinds of things you're likely to want to be shooting with a lens like this. But people's criticisms of the autofocus aren't generally weighted at the speed of the autofocus, but more the accuracy. And this can potentially sometimes be an issue. I've been shooting with these lenses for quite a number of years. I got the 35mm about 4 years ago. I got the 50mm about 3 years ago. I got the 24mm about 2 years ago. And I got the 85mm last year. So I have used all of these lenses quite extensively, and you do kind of see the same sort of thing. Generally, in terms of autofocus accuracy performance, what I have found on a DSLR, if you are autofocusing using the center autofocus point and you are focusing on an area that has kind of quite a high contrast, generally the autofocus is bob on most of the time. If you try photographing in dimmer light, the lens can sometimes struggle. It can tend to hunt a little bit more. And if you try photographing using autofocus points out at the edge of the screen, you're basically pissing into the wind with it. So what I've generally found in terms of the autofocus accuracy of these lenses is the sort of an optimal working distance for your subject to be. So what I've generally found is if your subject's quite close to the camera and the background's away in the distance, the lens and camera have no problems in determining what's the subject and what's the background. If, however, you're shooting at a subject that's kind of relatively a lot closer to your background than you, then the camera can get a little bit confused. So I've had it before with the likes of the 35. If I'm at the back of the room, I could track a couple walking in, walking past me, not a problem. If they walk down the room, probably about 3/4 of the way down, the camera might start jumping between them and the wall at the far end of the room. But last week, I was shooting a wedding in one of the hottest days of the year that we've had so far. Glorious bright sunshine. Shooting outside, so the camera should have absolutely no difficulties in trying to acquire focus. So I wanted to do a shot of the bride and groom walking towards me, but I wanted to shift them to the side of the frame and have like a row of trees kind of becoming more and more compressed closer to the camera. So I went with the 85mm to give me that compression and isolation that I was looking for, but I had to switch the autofocus points to one of the outer edges. Now, it wasn't one of the spot autofocus points in the camera, it was the outermost cross-type point of the camera. So I had the bride and groom start quite a distance from me and walk towards me, just so that they could kind of, loosen up a little bit and just kind of forget what they were doing and chat amongst themselves, so the picture looked that bit more natural. But what I found was that of the 15 pictures that I took as the bride and groom were getting gradually closer and closer and closer, the first half of the images were just completely locked on the background because the bride and groom was so far away. I don't think the camera could distinguish what it was trying to lock focus on. It was only a little bit closer that it was able to actually work out what I was trying to focus on. But even then, it didn't fully correct itself until the very last second, to the point that of the 15 shots that I took, 2 of them were in focus. Now, I knew that the shot was going to cause issues for the lens, but it was a staged shot. So to be honest, I was actually half expecting to have to ask the bride and groom just to kind of run the second half of it again, just to get the shot absolutely bob on. But as luck would have it, it didn't need to. But when I'm kind of going for the more candid moments, I only ever stick to the center focus points. Now with these lenses, you can get the USB dock that lets you plug the lenses straight into your computer, and then you can update the firmware or you can fine tune the autofocus. But to be honest, I've not seen Sigma release any new firmware for these lenses for ages. And in terms of the micro adjusting the autofocus, that's only any good if the lens is consistently front or back focused, which to be honest, none of these lenses are. It's just that the autofocus is wildly unpredictable if you put the lens in the wrong situations. So overall, to sum Sigma Art lenses up, optically, spot on. Build quality, awesome. The only real letdown, as I said, is the autofocus. Now, the one thing that I am interested in seeing is that all my experience with these and the autofocus issues have all been with DSLRs. But obviously, you can use these lenses on mirrorless cameras. So Sigma have the MC11 adapter that lets you put these onto Sony E-mount bodies. Sigma are also now offering these lenses in native E-mounts, so you don't need an adapter anymore. You can either buy them as native E-mount straight away, or if you already have Sigma lenses, you can send them back to Sigma and they will change the back section of the barrel and the mount to go from Canon, Nikon, Sigma mount straight over to Sony E-mount. Now, why this would be interesting is because the autofocus systems on mirrorless cameras work very differently to the ones in DSLRs. Because DSLRs use a separate autofocus chip, that can lead to potentially misalignments, inconsistencies and the likes. Whereas the autofocus on mirrorless obviously uses the sensor, and they use a mix of phase and contrast detection. So in theory, you shouldn't have any missed autofocus. Now, I have done numerous shots before using live view, either the contrast detection in the likes of the 5D Mark III. I've also used the dual pixel autofocus in the 7D Mark II. And I've never had that focus inconsistency that you get when using the optical viewfinder. I just don't particularly like having the camera held away like that for live view because, you know, it kind of makes the camera that bit more unstable. I prefer looking through the viewfinder. But it will be interesting to see because I have the Sony a7 III on pre-order along with the Sigma MC11 adapter. I'm just waiting for the Sony camera to go into stock. But once it arrives, I can then try these lenses out using a mirrorless system. And honestly, what I'm expecting to find is that the focusing inconsistency that I'm used to seeing with these lenses completely disappears. But if you are considering buying Sigma Art lenses for DSLRs right now, my personal opinion of them is fantastic image quality, fantastic build quality. Yes, the autofocus is a little bit temperamental at times, but for the price that you are paying for what you are getting, particularly if you buy these second hand, well worth the money. Obviously, you may be put off by the autofocus inconsistencies depending on what you are shooting, but unfortunately, that's just a trait of third-party lenses. You'd be far better off if autofocus is always paramount to you, then look towards native lenses, but they are probably going to be quite a bit more expensive. But for me, I've had Sigma's lenses now for numerous years, and yes, the autofocus can be a pain at times, but you do learn to work around them. But what about you? Are you a fan of Sigma's Art lenses, or are you not? Have you got them, or did you have them and now you've sold them, or you're considering buying them? Have you tried Sigma's Art lenses on a mirrorless camera? Do you get the same inconsistent autofocus? Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next video.